Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Fasya Asmara Kamila. You can call me Fasya. I come from TBI1. And then my ID number is T2019 1602. Here I am going to explain about my assignment from this book. It has been given by my lecturer, and then this video I will to explain about chapter 2 about the in about translation and interpreting. And then before I explain about my assignment, I want to apologize if I have many mistakes in this video. I want to pardon me please, and here I'm going to explain my explanation. For the first is, the aim of this chapter is not to attempt a comprehensive history and translation or translator thought. The this would be beyond the scope of any book. Instead, the main focus in the central recurring theme of word for word in Saint Forsyth's translation in debate that dominate much of translation theory. And then for the second is early Chinese. For the second is word of word or sense for sense. Up until the second half of the 20th century, Western translation theory seemed to look at in what genre state, and I did not translate them as interpreted, but as an orator keeping the same idea and form, or as one might say, the figure of touch, but in language which conform to our usage, and it is so doing I did not hold in necessary to write the word for the word, but I present first the general style and force of the language. And then for the next is early Chinese and Arabic discourse on translation. Testament is usually taken to be the clearest expression of the literal and free. In the translation, the same concepts have been expressed in one rich and ancient translation traditional, such as in Chinese and the Arabic word. For instance, Hak and Poland use similar terms when describing the history. And then for the next is introducing translation studies. The vocabulary of Hack and Pollard's description, such as the gloss on, so the influencer of modern Western translation terminology, the general truth of the argument being similar to the described about the is especially so because they are alternative translation for the term literary in the translation of meaning language. And then for the next is translation choice were expounded in the preface to their next, perhaps the most influential being by the religion, who directed an intensive translation program. And their prefaces consider the dilemma whichever first translation, whether to make a free policies in certain version adapted to the taste on the Chinese public, or a faithful literal repetition and therefore unreadable translation and interpreting. And then for the next is introduction. Translation student catches in language that is very culture about, and so which the can and can never fully correspond the real question according. I have to word for word in sense of sense. Either the translation learn the written speech as much as possible and move the writer for translation in interpreting. And then for the first is in the translation is to seek to communicate the same impression which is the are mentioned about the translation and interpreting. And then the impression will also depend on the level or education of understanding among the read- readership. And this is likely of often from the translation over understanding. And a special language of translation may be necessary for the example interpreting in one place with the imagined word where elsewhere the translation has to make do with a Hackner experience that cannot be impression on the foreign. And then other modern theological concept of the main problem with the writing on translation in this period was the criteria of judgment where translation and romantics as a reaction against such argument and contradiction. Translation theory is the second half of the 20th century made various attempts reader the concept of the operation, interpreting, and translation language. And and describe meaning and sensify them and to put together systematic this translation fundament the operation from the core of the following chapter in this book. And then for the first is case study. One assignment criteria. The area of assignment criteria is one where a more aspect writes a material of the translation assignment of a review or professional translation. This less aspect reader, usually a candidate for examination as a junior professional translation is interpreting to be how for the vocabulary used in the regular vocabulary and early translation theory and the Character Institute of Language. Uh, and they are give the example. And if the first is the concept transfer is information and evading of complete comprehension, the appropriate choice of vocabulary, idiom, technology, and regular. And then for the second is case study, the translation preface. Translation problems are source of extensive information in the translation method. And sometimes the function is justifying the production of new translation. And classic word, there was the case of English language translation and interpreting. In the introduction of the translation, the reason given by for the reception there had been later publication of receiver and corrected edition of the French original and that there was a need to concept translation and interpreting in this English language. And then there are language like Arabic language, Chinese language, and Turkey language, and etc. And here it can be concluded the translation has a side sign each time, but each language that will be translated. Many are different, but it will be have a different meaning too. Therefore, if we want to acquire or learn each language, it would be better to first know the way the people with different language usually to doing. Like language in all countries, they have their own way of translation in way they know that already exists from the history they have until now, because we have to protect and preserve history until we look forward to be, because it will always be useful for our safety and in this future to improve education in a country. And only actually I don't understand about the all this and the chapter 2, but I only understand that in chapter 2 it is explaining the each new title is a different way of translation and interpreting in each language, and it has been applied in a very century that has developed in antiquity. If you look carefully, each new title explains the history of each language, like Chinese, Arabic, and etc., which is the part of how to solve in so that translation and interpreting work and developed in a good way, because every language has its own application. Before I close my video, I want to apologize. Pardon me please if I have many mistakes in this video, and I want to you give my pardon, and I want to you give my pardon, and then thank you. Assalamualaikum.